again, everyone. Welcome to the Connecticut Psychological Association Social Justice Speaker Series. We are delighted to have Ms. Leah Nelson with us as tonight's esteemed speaker. Leah will focus on a very important topic tonight, which is afterwards. When violence occurs, the state's concept of justice leaves out many victims, survivors, and communities. What would they say if we invited them to speak? Afterward is an effort to broaden the discourse and bring unheard voices into conversation where they belong. A warm welcome, Ms. Nelson. My name is Shiva, and I serve as the chair of Social Justice Committee, and joining me tonight are our passionate social justice members, Anne, Kyler, and Patricia. And two of members, Sydney and Beth, unfortunately couldn't make it tonight. We will miss them. As always, I want to express sincere appreciation to our sponsors. Their support is the cornerstone of our ability to sustain the series. And I'm going to share these slides with you. And I'm going to start with the 2023 donors. As you see, we had all the supports in 2023, and for 2024, I'm thrilled to say that we received donation from Comprehensive Neuropsychological Services for the 4th consecutive year, and I'm proud to say that I'm affiliated with this company. Also, we received donation from CPA Educational Foundation for the 2nd consecutive year. Thank you so much for this support, and looking forward to your generous donations in 2024. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kyler to share more information with you.
All right. Thank you so much, Shiva. That was beautiful. So on behalf of the Planning Committee, again, we are thrilled that you could join us this evening, and we sincerely hope that you'll continue to attend our future speaker session. And we are enthusiastic about Leah's presentation this evening. As a brief reminder, the CPA Social Justice Speaker Series offers these free monthly meetings to CPA members, the wider Connecticut community, and our nationwide supporters. And I welcome you to our speaker series this evening. So now it's my job to turn it over to Anne, who's going to share more about our speaker's biography with you.
And you're muted.
Sorry, Kyler, you're going to have to admit everybody. I'm not doing a good job of doing double duty.
They keep popping in. I'll do it for you.
Yeah, thank you. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Leah Nelson, who conducts original research into the drivers of poverty and incarceration in Alabama. She is Appleseed's principal expert on the collateral consequences of fines, fees, and other legal financial obligations, and leads their work to develop a holistic understanding of and develop a strategy to meet the needs of victims of violent crimes who come from communities disproportionately impacted by criminalization and violence. Leah brings expertise in civil asset forfeiture, drug policy, and drivers of incarceration to Appleseed's reform agenda. Prior to joining Alabama Appleseed, Leah spent 5 years in the Capital Habeas Unit of the Middle District of Alabama Federal Defenders, supporting the appeals of death sentence individuals seeking new trials. Before that, she worked as a reporting fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center. In 2021, she served as volunteer investigator on the legal team that helped Claudette Colvin successfully petition for the expungement of her 1955 juvenile conviction for refusing to give up her seat on Montgomery bus to a white woman. Leah is a 2006 graduate of Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism and a 2002 graduate of the University of Connecticut. She lives in Montgomery, Alabama with her husband and 2 children. And before I turn it over to Leah, I'd like to just say we're very grateful to Dr. Will Nelson her dad, a longstanding CPA and member, for introducing Leah to us. So excited to hear your talk tonight. Thank you so much, Leah.
Thanks. Thank you so much for having me. And hi, Mom and Dad and various friends whose names I see on this screen. So, and hi, everybody else. So, why am I here? Partially because my dad invited me, and also because I do work that I think probably does intersect with some interests that psychologists may have, that could perhaps broaden your understanding of what is going on with people who live in this complicated intersection of communities that experience high levels of violence, where there's a lot of crime, there's a lot of incarceration, and there's a lot of people who are personally impacted by that violence. I want to share a little bit about myself first. I'm not a doctor. I am just a Ms. I have a degree in journalism. I grew up in Manchester, Connecticut. I moved to Alabama 14 years ago, and I am staying. And I work now as research director of an organization called Alabama Appleseed Center for Law and Justice, which does a couple of different things. We do a little bit of direct representation of people who are incarcerated under a law that has them sentenced to life without parole in prison, even though their third strike resulted in physical injury to no one. They never hurt anybody, but they're set to die in prison. We've gotten 15 of those guys out. And we also do advocacy at the State House, which is driven by original research that I lead and do in partnership with many wonderful organizations here in Alabama, trying to understand what communities that are users of the criminal justice system, for lack of a better term, consumers of the criminal justice system, so justice-involved people, how does it actually feel to them when they find themselves going through the system? What are their experiences like with police, with attorneys, with courts, with incarceration? We take everything that we learn from our clients and from the people that we survey and talk with and try to boil it down to action items that can be accomplished with policy change or practice change. And we work at the State House, we work with jurisdictions if they'll let us. We do culture change, so that looks like organizing on the ground and trying to share information within Alabama. And I'll say this, I know that Alabama has a reputation because I used to be from Connecticut, so I'm familiar. It is, as advertised, a really conservative place. We are executing someone tonight, and that is really hard. And I just want everybody to, be aware, like in many ways, Alabama is what you expect, but it's not just that. Working here, I have encountered the most creative, tenacious, brilliant people who are fighting pretty long odds and still getting stuff done. So they're not the majority, but there's a lot of them. And I want to make sure, as I'm representing Alabama and Connecticut tonight, to be clear that, yes, there's Roy Moore and Jeff Sessions and all the people that you see in the news. Tommy Tuberville is here, right? But there's also organizers and faith leaders and a lot of really cool people who are doing very hard work. And I have the privilege of interacting with them all the time and maybe sometimes being one of them. So, please just broaden your idea of Alabama and know also that a lot of the phenomena that I'll be talking about tonight, although it comes from research that's done here in this state, is actually pretty widespread throughout the United States. It looks a little bit different depending on where you are, but there's not a state that's getting the balance of criminal justice quite right. So as I said, we do a lot of work at Appleseed through surveys and talking with impacted people who are dealing with the system. And we tend to come at things from a defense-oriented perspective. I worked on death penalty cases. My boss worked at the Equal Justice Initiative, which some of you might be familiar with. Brian Stevenson is the leader of that. So she worked on death penalty cases. We all kind of come from this background that says we need to dismantle this incredibly harmful system. And that is true. We also, though, over time, listening to people that we are talking with who have been incarcerated, who have had pretty horrific experiences with over-policing, with over-criminalization, particularly the criminalization of poverty, who have themselves been incarcerated. As we talk with those folks over time, we heard a pretty complicated story from them. We have 2 formerly incarcerated staff members, and both of them lost very close family members to homicide. And as we listened to our colleagues, one of them is named Callie Greer. She's our community navigator, and she lost her son Mercury to gun violence in Montgomery in 1999. The other one is our reentry coordinator and former client. His name is Ronald McKeithen, and he lost his mother to homicide while he was incarcerated. The 2 of them got us thinking about how important it was, even as we're trying to engage in police reform and criminal justice reform and tackling the overwhelming violence in our prisons and excessive sentences, that we also wanted to be sensitive to the realities that many people who are incarcerated or justice involved also have experienced violent victimization. And that's part of what informs their perception of the system as well. And since we exist to hopefully reduce some of the pressure that they're experiencing as the result of our state, we need to really understand what they want and need and have experienced and seen if we're going to do that job well, even if that complicates our agenda and means we have to slow down. So in 2022 and 2023, we surveyed, and if you don't mind, I am going to share some slides. I won't keep you on PowerPoint the whole time. I'll probably flick through some of these pretty quickly, but I will go ahead and share this screen. So, and again, I apologize. I have a screen over here. So if it looks like I'm looking away, it's because I'm looking at my other screen. So our state makes a lot of assumptions about what people who are affected by violence want and what they need. At the top, we have very conservative lawmakers, a governor, an attorney general who equate punishment with justice. They think more punishment means more justice. We also have a very active group of reform-minded organizations that tend to think that dismantling forms of punishment equals justice. And the answer, it doesn't lie in the middle, it just lies outside of that binary. So we went about trying to see what people actually felt justice would look like, if they could define it, and we asked them. So we surveyed 401 people who were survivors of violent crime or had lost loved ones to homicide, and just asked them what their experience was like. We made sure that our sample reflected roughly the demographics of communities that we know are overly impacted by violence. And we went pretty far out of our way to make sure that we included some pretty hard to reach communities, including people who don't always get asked. We do have a victims' rights organization in Alabama, and that's common, I think, throughout the United States. Here in Alabama, it's led by a woman whose brother was a sheriff in a rural county, and he died in the line of duty. She is a white woman, and she's very, very conservative. Now, her loss is real, and her response to it is valid. She wants more punishment, and she wants to make sure that sentences are long so that people who have hurt other people never get out of prison. And I can't judge her. She lost her brother, but she is not really representative of what the population that's most likely to have that experience looks like. She doesn't come from where they all come from. So in seeking out communities to survey and sit down with, we went to Selma, which has a very high rate of violent crime, an enormous amount of gun violence and homicide death there. It's also an almost completely Black city that's been divested from by the state of Alabama. It's hard to spend money in Selma because there's not like places to spend it. We worked with undocumented immigrants who generally didn't speak English well, so we did a session with them that was led by an interpreter, and we had some note takers. So I don't speak Spanish, which was the language the session was conducted in, but we were able to get really rich notes from just what their experiences are like when they often, this was a group of domestic violence survivors who are unable to access police because of language barriers and fear of deportation. We talked with formerly incarcerated people. Our prisons are violent inside, and also many people who are incarcerated experience violence, prior to incarceration. And we wanted to know, like, how does it feel when you, who have been incarcerated, might need to call the police? Do you even do it? We sought out members of the LGBTQ community, and particularly Black trans women who are, as we know, nationally at a very high risk of death by gun violence, domestic violence, and other forms of violence, and everywhere in the United States tend not to feel that safe contacting authorities for a variety of reasons. And then throughout, we were also worked with people who were survivors of domestic violence who also experienced substance use disorder. Research shows those two things happen together at the same time. Substance use disorder predicts being a victim of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, and being a victim of domestic partner violence or intimate partner violence predicts substance use disorder. I should say I'm using the word victim. It's a controversial word. Some people prefer survivor. Pardon my choice. It's really just shorthand. Like, it's complicated to talk about this. Some people feel very alienated by the term survivor, and most of the people that I talked with preferred the word victim, so that's what I'm using. So I am going to show you my friend Callie, who is our community navigator, who is a formerly incarcerated woman from Montgomery, who, as I said, lost her son to gun violence and has done incredible work in this state, bringing people together to start really hard conversations. She helped connect us with the 401 people that we needed to survey. And even more valuably, she literally cooked dinner for dozens and dozens of people as we did focus groups around the state, so that we could sit down and feed them, and she would share her story so that they understood that she was one of them in some way. And then she would facilitate a conversation about what people had experienced and what they needed and wanted and had to say. So let's get into what the survey found. Of the 401 people that we surveyed, 52% of them, more than half, had lost a loved one to homicide. And then in a really kind of stunning to me turn of events, more than half of those had lost more than one person. So we had to change the survey part of the way through, realizing that we couldn't just ask what had happened after their loved one was killed, because different things happened after different times. You can see the slide. 60% had been beaten, 56% sexually assaulted. This is a state with a high level of firearm ownership, and 45% of them had been shot at, 13% shot. Sexual assault was really common, and 39% had been raped. And of all of these people, almost 3/4 had been convicted of a crime themselves, including 65% who had been convicted of a felony. So we're talking about people who have experienced the system from both sides. And that was really important to us, because in Alabama, the framing is very often, and I think this is common everywhere because it simplifies things. The framing about how crime works and who are criminals is that there's criminals who like the criminal lifestyle, and there's victims who are innocent. And criminals come and victimize the victims, and then they go back to this lifestyle of crime and mayhem that they prefer. That is exactly the binary that we're trying to break down, and I feel pretty good that we at least were talking to the right people who have experienced it all. Because of the same communities that experience crime also may engage in it. It's also really important to note that of all of these 401 people, including lots and lots of people with felony convictions, only 14% of them had been convicted of a crime that resulted in physical injury to another person. A lot of these are drug offenses, things that are serious, but didn't necessarily actually result in anyone being hurt. But all of them had themselves been violently victimized in some way. Overwhelmingly, except for people who had lost someone to homicide, people knew the person who had harmed them. It was a family member, a romantic partner, someone they knew from the neighborhood. And again, that really is at odds with the sort of horror story narrative that tends to dominate national and local conversations about crime. These are not strangers. They're people from the community, and that complicates decisions like, do we call the police and how do we proceed and how safe are we given the public safety resources and structures that are available. I'm going to turn now to who these people were when they were children. I worked with a social worker to develop a part of the survey that was based on the Adverse Childhood Experiences survey, because we wanted to know, like, I guess, how people scored on that metric and what their childhoods had been like. Again, you can see the slide, but I'll pull out some of the headlines, including that 4 in 10 of the people that we surveyed went without water for drinking or washing or without heat in the winter. These were people who, as children, witnessed a lot of violence in their home, experienced a lot of violence in their home, including sexual violence against themselves. They had a huge amount of instability. So they were evicted often, they changed schools often. And the neighborhoods they lived in also were similarly very violent. So they just saw a lot of violence around them. And they didn't have good experiences with the state, right? Like, as a child, I think it's reasonable to expect I will be able to be warm. I will be able to have water. These are basic human rights. And these are people who, as children, didn't have access to safety or warmth or food. And I think that that's a really important thing to sit with as we think about how they deal with violence once they get older. So that leads me to the next really astonishing finding, although it's only astonishing if you didn't already know it, because this tracks national statistics. More than half, 53% of the 401 people we surveyed say they never or almost never call the police when they are crime victims or witness a crime. We asked them, if you don't call the police, why not? People had really complicated reasons. They were afraid of retaliation by the police or by people in their community, because a lot of these folks are formerly incarcerated. They were afraid police would just arrest them. Some of them had been arrested when they called the police. In fact, that was a common theme, that when they called the police, somehow everybody would end up going to jail. People who were from minoritized communities that are marginalized here felt like police would not treat them well. Particularly the undocumented immigrants felt like they couldn't talk to police. No one made an effort to get an interpreter. They did sometimes find themselves or had friends who found their, ability to stay in the United States questioned. And the trans women we spoke with said, well, if I call the police, I'm going to have to explain why I don't match my ID. A lot of these were trans people who had transitioned but hadn't formally changed, their identification. That's very difficult to do in Alabama. And it's also, it's a long process anywhere. And they just felt like, I don't want to deal with this. So I am not going to call the police. I'm just going to take my chances with some other form of justice. And again, I think that goes back to what their childhoods were like, right? I mean, if you can't rely on the world to make sure that you have food and warmth and water and some basic level of safety and stability, why would you rely on it to protect you after something really terrible happens? So getting into kind of, it looks like, sorry, there's a typo in here because in fact, they don't trust the state. I'm going to just fix this. They don't trust the state to do the right thing when it comes to handling the aftermath of violence. The title of the report we produced was Afterward, because that was what we were focusing on. What happens after violence occurs? This is not about preventing it, but just looking at what we could do better and what we are currently doing and how we are failing, and where there might be success after people experience victimization. So we asked them about incarceration. You know, did the person who hurt you or hurt your loved one, were they imprisoned, and did that make you feel safer? Only half of them felt safer after the person was incarcerated. And again, there's a lot of talk about victim services and what victims want and need up at our state house, led by that woman I mentioned earlier. But then when we asked, well, we hear all about victims and what they want and how it's important to fund district attorneys' offices so that they can serve victims. Did you talk with a victim service specialist? Most of them did not. And then of those, most of them or many of them didn't feel like the services that were provided to them really met their needs. So we asked them what they would have wanted. Everybody said counseling. They wanted someone to talk with about other stuff. They wanted guidance. And then they had some material needs that were not met. I mean, domestic violence victims need a place to go. People who have lost someone to homicide may have inherited that person's child. They need diapers and food and stuff for kids. All kinds of like administrative assistance that just doesn't exist for these people because the system is not set up to serve their needs. It's set up to punish the people who committed the crime. Now, it is appropriate under the rule of law to respond and sanction and hold accountable people who hurt other people. That's fine, although not the way we do it in Alabama. But it is just so striking that that's not the priority that was expressed to us by victims. That wasn't what they felt was justice. They had other needs. They didn't prioritize punishment. They needed healing and support and some type of restoration. And I don't really think any state is doing that quite right. And certainly Alabama isn't. So that was a really sobering and recentering finding. I'm going to share with you a little bit about this woman, Summer, who I met in Selma. I've known her for years, actually. I met her a long time ago before her brother was killed. And I was really gratified that she felt safe talking with me. So we talked for about 2 hours about what it was like when her younger brother, who was 21, died from gun violence in Selma. Summer was actually there when he died, and she was the auntie to his little boy, and her brother's, the mother of this little boy just didn't feel able to take care of him after her brother died. So Summer inherited this little boy and became his caregiver. And she talked about not having any of the things that she needed to do that materially. Like, because she wasn't legally his guardian, she didn't have any ability to get financial support that a legal guardian could get. She also needed to help her family plan a funeral and pay for it. And again, there was no support for that. And then most importantly, she and many other people, both men and women, talked about needing to manage violent impulses in their own family, because it's very common for retaliatory cycles of violence to break out in communities that don't trust police. If you don't trust the police and you lost someone to homicide, you may want to take matters into your own hands. And it especially falls to women, and particularly Black women in Alabama, because homicide rates are very high in Black communities and most of the victims are men. It falls to these women to make sure that their dad or brother or some male relative doesn't grab their gun and go out and shoot somebody else and kind of keep things going. And she talked about that being kind of the hardest thing of all. And what she wanted was, in addition to the material support to care for her nephew, was just like someone to care, someone to know, someone she could call and talk with. And that just didn't exist for her, except in the form of Kelly, the community navigator who works for Alabama Appleseed. She's the person who introduced me to Summer a long time ago. And I'm turning to her because aside from all of the horrible, heartbreaking things that I learned in the course of doing this research, I also learned that communities organically, usually led by a woman or someone who has experienced violence, are already coming together to care for each other in informal ways. And this was one of the only bright spots in all of this research. I was going in at the invitation of organizations that existed to support each other. So this organization in Selma that Callie started, an organization is probably not quite the right word because they're not that formal, but people who get together and have each other's backs and support each other and talk and have had the same shared experience. That was repeated over and over again. The Hispanic Interest Coalition of Alabama supports and includes in its leadership people who have had this experience. The Knights and Orchids Society, the TKO Society, was one of the most incredible encounters I had. This is an organization founded and led by queer Black folks from Selma and Montgomery, mostly Black trans women who are there for each other because no one else is. And so a big takeaway from all of this work is that we have the seeds of a different system already planted in Alabama. And I would bet that these types of seeds exist elsewhere. There are people that you can go to and talk with about what victims and survivors want and need, and maybe just what they want and need more of. And that's what I want to kind of leave you with. This is not a hopeless situation. It's a really hard one and it's really sticky, but I don't think you can say a solution exists, but a response that is more competent exists. And it's something that we should be learning from, as I am not a practitioner who works with people, but I certainly informally do. But all of you, I would imagine do talk with people who have these experiences. And I think it's just important to know that it's not always the state that needs to respond. Sometimes what needs to happen is listening. So I'm going to leave it there. I have a lot more data and more slides, but I feel like, maybe I've talked for a half an hour and there might be questions or a discussion to be had. So I would like to invite you to ask anything you might like to ask or talk with each other.
Leah?
Yes, Dad.
Hello. So I have the honor of the first question.
Go for it.
So can you talk a little bit about how you as an individual and you as a representative of Appleseed connect with you've talked about your connections with other people like Callie and individuals. Can you talk about how you as an individual and you as a representative of Appleseed connect with other organizations, and a tiny bit about the work that you're doing with academic institutions, like at the University of Alabama at Birmingham?
Sure. Yeah, so I have a journalism degree. And that just basically means that I spent a year at Columbia learning how to ask questions, because that's all journalists do. And I use that framework to approach the work that I do at Appleseed. And I think it's a really, it's one very valuable way of approaching this work. We have a couple of former journalists on staff. We also have some social workers who have a slightly different framework, but there's actually a lot of similarities. So I obviously am a white woman from the Northeast. I am also Jewish. It is not necessarily like the easiest on-ramp to talk with local, usually Black, usually Christian, definitely Alabamian people. So there can be some cultural mismatches. I've used that to my advantage. I don't try to pretend that I'm from here or that I'm like the people that I'm trying to connect with. Instead, I tend to just say, like, as you can tell, I'm really not like you. So talk to me like I'm 5. Please explain to me, you know, as I was in some of these rooms with focus groups of people who had all had shared experiences, there was one group of men who were all formerly incarcerated. And we were eating barbecue in Huntsville. And one of them said something. And then the rest of them all kind of chuckled. And I was, you know, furiously taking notes. And I was like, hey guys, like you all just laughed. Can someone tell me what was it? What was the thing? Because I didn't have that shared experience with you. And I think, you know, I got an answer. It can be helpful to just, if you're an alien, you've got to just lean into it. And that's what I am in Alabama. And I do some work with academics as well. You know, because I'm not a data analyst. So I've built some relationships with them, and, you know, those are much more straightforward.
Leah, have the academics published this work? I mean, it's so powerful, the information you shared and the stories you've told. Like it's a mixed methods paper waiting to happen.
Yeah. So Appleseed published this. It's long, and it contains most of our descriptive findings, although not all, because the survey was really extensive. So we wanted to pull out themes. It also contains Callie's macaroni and cheese recipe. So I highly recommend going online and flipping through to the end, because you can get a whole bunch of information and a really good recipe for macaroni and cheese. I hope to find someone with the capacity to do some additional analysis, like exploratory analysis of the data. I am not being modest when I say don't know how to do data analysis. I know what questions I would like answered, but I do not have the capacity to answer them. I think it would be very interesting to look at relationships between some of the ACE findings and attitudes toward police later in life, because I certainly heard over and over again, just almost like, why would you call the police? Are you nuts? I mean, there's even a sort of avoidance of any type of formal system that might be available to help. I spoke with a man who was stabbed and needed emergency medical attention. And his sister took him to the hospital, and he lied about how, you know, I fell on a knife or something. And his sister told the doctor that he'd been stabbed. And once that was out, he made her take him out of the emergency room and take him to a different emergency room, because doctors will call the police if they think a crime has occurred. And this man didn't feel safe talking with police. Now, I don't know exactly why. Many of the people I talk with have outstanding warrants for their arrest, but very often those warrants are like about unpaid fines or unpaid child support or something like that. When we hear there's a warrant for someone's arrest, we assume like, they're a wanted murderer, but like usually they're a wanted debtor. They're still going to get arrested if they encounter the police. So it seems really important to further investigate the relationship between experiences that would indicate to someone as a child that the system can't be counted on, and what that person feels that they have access to as an adult when they're a crime victim. I mean, that's one of the many things I would like to look into more. And I have, transcripts of I interviewed a lot of people for this. So if anybody wants to do that, hit me up.
Leah, you shared extremely important information about how you create conversation with people, like acting as a 5-year-old child who doesn't know the information, and you ask. So it needs courage. And it reminds me of the training we recently received about trauma-based teaching. That's how, like, it's important for us to be like a child and to ask students about their own experience, to ask our patients about their own experience. This is very informative. So is it something that you have practiced, or you just created automatically when you have some kind of conversation with them?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's something I've practiced. Again, one way to approach journalism, and not everyone approaches it this way, but I did, always thinking, people have experiences that I haven't had, and I don't know what those experiences are. Systems work in ways that seem weird. I wonder why. That's the approach of journalism is supposed to be, that you're asking open-ended questions and kind of tolerating the answers and documenting them, rather than coming in with a framework for what you think you're going to hear. Now, we all come in with a framework for what we think we're going to hear and what we think is happening in any situation. But with a lot of practice, I have, I guess, disciplined myself to tolerate answers that are challenging to what I would like the answer to be. So this research project was very emotionally challenging because I want to like burn it all down in Alabama, right? I mean, before I worked at Appleseed, I worked on death penalty cases, and I had clients that were executed. I hate our criminal legal system here, and I want it to be straightforward to solve. I want there to be obvious things that we can do, and it is complicated when you listen to people who have been incarcerated and are talking about how terrible the prisons are, or who have been pulled over and they know it's because they were Black. They know the way that the police officer and the judge treated them is because of their race or their gender or both. And they're telling you it was terrible. And you're like, well, don't you hate the police then? Like, and they're like, yes, but I don't want to get rid of police. And it's, I mean, I am not, super hard left. I think we need police, but it would have been easier for me if I wasn't hearing from Callie, my research partner, who's the woman from Selma, and so many other people, as often as they would talk about times that they were mistreated by the system, they also talked about times that the system wasn't there and they wish that police had arrested the drug dealers on their corner, or the kids that are, selling guns out of the back of their car. It was challenging because it was going to make my job harder as an advocate. But these are things if you're going to try to change the system, you could have to deal with. Well, I guess if you're going to try to change the system in a way that it is responsive to the needs of those who are having terrible experiences with it, you really have to understand what those needs and experiences are, even if that means that your job is going to be harder. So I just told myself that a lot of times, and that's how I've approached the work. And I will say, like, it's very well received. So I get a lot of like validation from the people that I communicate with. And that's, that certainly makes it easier. I see someone named Lauren has her hand up.
Right, Lauren?
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you both so much. Thank you so much for this talk. I have really enjoyed it. I am really enjoying it. And forgive me if this is too much of a psychology question, but what you were just saying, I'm curious how you understand that, and if people were able to elaborate on kind of how they can hold both such negative experiences with the carceral system and also sort of this desire potentially for more policing, or at least a preference for not the abolition of policing. So just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
It's something I think about all the time. I mean, that was really like one of the questions in my mind that I hoped would be answered by this and by this whole, research project. I think, so listening to people and talking about what they wanted afterward, they didn't generally talk about punishment, but people want to be safe, and they want security and they want reliability. So it's like what we have is police. So they at least want bad guys off street corners. They want different types. They want police to behave in a different way, to prioritize, violent crime. They want incarceration to be more restorative because they know people are coming home to their communities, and they don't want them to be horribly traumatized by being in terrible prisons. Many of them want to talk with the person who hurt them. So I don't think when people say, I wish the police had come, or that they're talking about like police as they actually exist necessarily. They are talking about someone who would make things better. And the word we have for that is police. And I also will say, like, some of them had mixed experiences with police. Callie, again, is really my guide in all of this. She's just exceptionally candid about her experiences, and her feelings, and is remarkably good at saying everything that needs to be said, but in a way that doesn't completely, blow you away and make you feel unable to respond. So Callie was, she would describe herself as a delivered drug addict. That's how she frames it. But back when she was actively using drugs, she was raped. And she talks a lot about the sheriff's deputy who connected with her and made it safe for her to testify against the person who raped her, and that person was incarcerated. So that was a relationship that mattered to her, and she remembers him very fondly. And it's interesting because this particular deputy later went on to be the sheriff for Montgomery, and other people know him as a racist who abused his power. So I guess, we contain multitudes. So does that guy. So does Callie. And people are just complicated and don't always make perfect sense, especially in their reactions to trauma.
Thank you so much for that. That was awesome.
Leah, I did my graduate work at the University of Mississippi a long time ago. And if there is another place in the country that is as repressive and oppressive as Alabama, I suspect Mississippi might be that place.
Oh yeah, our unofficial state motto is "Thank God for Mississippi."
Yeah. I worked for 2 years in a community mental health center down there. and saw many of the kinds of things that you've seen or that you've described, at least tonight. So I will tell you that I give you enormous respect and credit for staying there and fighting the good fight, because I got out as soon as I could do it, because I found it daunting. And the fact that you've stayed and continued to do this is just, I think, so remarkable and so so worthy of respect. In thinking about the questions that other folks have asked about why would you want the police still to be there or still to do things, the clients that I had who were frankly abused by the system in Mississippi at the time um, didn't want necessarily more policing, they said, and they didn't have the idea of the concept of justice. But for them, it always came down to fairness. What's fair in society? And the reason they wanted the police to still be involved was because the police had power and other people didn't. And what they really wanted was somebody in power to be fair.
Yes, I think that is a really good way of putting what it is that people desire. They don't want these police, but they want there to be someone who sees and responds to them in a way that makes sense. And right now we call that police. I also think, being a victim is not an ideology or an identity. It's like it's the result of something that happened to you. And I see this a lot in advocacy spaces where advocates mistake the people whose interests they're serving for activists. And I will, a very striking example of that, separately from the criminal justice space, where people who are formerly incarcerated, they're not all police abolitionists. They don't all want to completely dismantle the system. They have, as I've described, really complicated feelings about it that don't align with an ideological agenda. The same is true when I used to escort, back when abortion was legal. I would walk women who were seeking abortions into the clinic because there were protesters there, and I just would walk them in so they didn't have to walk in by themselves. I did that for a while, but I stopped doing it after a very vocal group of advocates took over organizing the escorts, because the way that those advocates framed it, it was like getting an abortion was a political statement. But I knew from walking these women in, it was like I'd have 30 seconds with them, but some of them would take longer and explain that they were opposed to abortion and they were horrified at what they were doing, but they needed to do it for whatever reason. And, I was not there to judge them, or, I was there to walk them in. But I think it's really important to separate any political agenda from the very specific individual experience of the person that you're dealing with, who's in front of you, who has a whole complicated existence that doesn't align with anything and probably doesn't really want to have the thing that makes them of interest to me, right? I mean, because I'm interested in you if you're formerly incarcerated or lost someone to violence. You don't want that.
Beautiful conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And thanks for accepting our invitation. It's 4 minutes to 8. So, Kyler, would you like to do the closing?
Certainly. So, again, thank you all for joining us this evening. It was a wonderful presentation. It's really powerful to try to find words for all. It seems like the daunting word really kind of came to mind. But again, thank you for showing up with these folks here tonight. So our next social justice event can be scheduled for February 20th, which happens to be the World Day of Social Justice. So It's going to feature our own Dr. Patricia Barungi as our esteemed speaker. And what I want to do is end by emphasizing that our ability to maintain this speaker series, the social justice speaker series, relies on fundraising, and we greatly appreciate all donations moving forward. You are able to support. The donation link, mailing address are going to be put in the chat here shortly. And don't forget, for those of you who've registered for continuing education, I invite you to complete that CE evaluation link to receive your certificate, which is also going to be added to the chat here in a moment. Once again, thank you for joining us this evening, and we eagerly anticipate your presence in February.